research for high-intensity interval training, specifically in aquatics, and how it's a proven source for physical activity. So help me in welcoming her, Dr. Elizabeth Nagle.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. It is an absolutely beautiful campus. I've never been. Very, very impressed, and impressed with the students in the program as well. And special thanks to Dr. Prinz for inviting me. So today I'm going to talk to you about something that's very near and dear to my heart, and that's the area of aquatic exercise. Currently I'm faculty at the University of Pittsburgh. I teach graduate and undergraduate, help to oversee the undergraduate program. My research agenda, if you will, is in the area of aquatics. Having been a swimmer all my life, I kind of converted a little bit within the last maybe 10 years or so with my research, having first started with swimmers, now working more with an aquatic exercise population. And I'll explain a little bit about why in just a little while, but I will go ahead and get started. So I think a nice way to get this off the ground is to just ask a really simple question. We use the word aerobic activity or aerobic exercise very, very often, every day probably for the majors. What is that? Can we define that? Who can help me out here? Got to pick on the class. Got to get somebody. There's no... Don't be shy. Who's going to help me? I'll call Dr. Klein. Come on. Yeah, thank you. Perfect. So we're using large muscle groups, ideally performed, and it's an activity performed somewhat continuously, right? In a rhythmic fashion in some cases, right? And we're using the oxygen transport system, right? So we're using oxygen. And how many of you would you say exercise or engage in physical activity, what do you think, more than twice a week? Okay, let's convert that to minutes. What do you think? Anybody over 100 minutes a week? Fantastic. Anybody over 200 minutes a week? Woo, impressive. All right, well, I can honestly say, looking at this population, that you are the exception to America, all right, in terms of how many people are participating in physical activity these days. And I did put, different activities up because we can have different activities that are not as structured as exercise, right, be considered aerobic. So don't forget about that. All right, so we talked, I just gave a little hint to this slide in terms of how active we are as a country. And I'm sure you're learning this in coursework and have seen it on the media all the time. We're not very active. In fact, according to CDC and some recent evidence put out in the physical activity guidelines recommendations, we're looking at about, 25% for males, maybe around 20% for females, who really meet those recommendations for aerobic and physical activity. And that's just not enough, all right? We also, with those recommendations, and what are the recommendations? You can see it right there, but I know that you've learned these before. How many minutes? What are we looking at? What was that? 150, like at least 150 minutes per week, right, of aerobic activity. Let's use that word aerobic again, right? And they're also making recommendations on muscle strengthening, right, for lots of reasons that are very important to health. You can't see this super well, but I just circled the alternative to that 150 minutes would be 75 minutes of vigorous, right? At least 75 minutes of vigorous, which is what I think some of you all, you know where I'm going with this, what some of you all do each week, maybe as an alternative, okay? So getting back to that intensity issue, all right, let's just kind of clarify that for a second. We know that if we perform something more vigorously, we're going to be expending more calories, right? That's for sure. There's a lot of different ways we can measure this, and you perhaps have learned some of these in your laboratories. How many of you have a wearable on right now? Right? Okay, not as many as I thought, but that can measure heart rate very often, and we can clarify. Let's hope I get my little Good, I got it right. We can clarify intensity a number of ways: metabolic equivalent tasks, looking at a percent VO2, or heart rates. One really popular way we like to do it at the University of Pittsburgh is looking at perceived exertion. All right, so we'll talk about that a little bit more, but with the higher intensities that we were talking about before, we want to zero in on that vigorous, moderate to vigorous, kind of going where we're headed with this talk, okay? And we're looking at high intensities that are at least 6 metabolic equivalent tasks or higher, right? Pretty high in the heart rate ranges, okay? And also high on the perceived exertion scale. We use a scale at the University of Pittsburgh that's been validated. It's a different scale. It's been validated, and it's a smaller scale. It's 0 to 10. All right. So instead of the 14 to 16 that you see, we might be looking at 6 to 10. Okay, on the RPE scale. You're going to see that again in a little while. All right. So here we are with HIIT training. All right. A nice lead into the aquatics. Now, I'm not an expert at land HIIT training. In fact, I think it's almost not a safe thing for me because I'm like a fish out of water. But it's very, very popular right now. It's one of the most popular forms of activity according to ACSM. How many of you do HIIT training? Some. Okay. Good, I'm glad to hear that. We know that it's really time effective. We can get a lot of work done in a short period of time with these quick blasts, right? These quick blasts of alternating between really high intensities that we mentioned before and periods of recovery or rest. So I just wanted to show you this clip real quick. All right, oh good, it's there. All right. So if you Google, he's going really fast. Okay, so you, can I get rid of this abs looking picture there? That's not, there we go. The before and after. Thank you. But if I was just curious if I Googled HIIT training, what I would see. And there's some very good examples out there and some kind of, to me, what look to be quite unsafe examples. But the point is that HIIT training comes in many different ways, shapes, or forms, all right? A lot of the original, let's back up for a second. Interval training has been around for years and years and years. Okay, just regular interval training, going back to the definition of what we call fartlek training. High intensity interval training, all right, has evolved quite a bit in the last 20, 30 years, and we see even hints of it working with track runners back in the 1970s. Dr. Tabata did kind of a groundbreaking study in the mid-90s looking at that 2010. Does anybody do Tabata in here? 2010 performed at an extremely high intensity that would technically be higher than your VO2 max, all right, over several minutes of time. And at that point, he compared it to a continuous training program and saw greater improvements in VO2 max and a lot of different cardiovascular outcomes. So the Tabata method kind of kicked things off. We've got Gabala in the research who's done different types of HIIT protocols. And the HIIT protocols can be more conservative. They can be several minutes long at intensities that are not as high as your VO2 max. All right, but there's all different ways to play with it. There's all different combinations. We see it with resistance training, whole body exercise like this little clip here. So it's really popular. And we submitted an article with HIIT training to ACSM, and one of the comments back was, well, it's not as popular as it was. And I really disagree with that. I think that it's as popular as ever, if not more so. I think we're going to continue to see a lot of HIIT training in research, okay, and in working with the masses. Did I? Okay, so thank you. The health benefits of HIIT training. So we know that for many it's really enjoyable. It's challenging, it motivates us, gets us pumped, all right? Well, there's also a tremendous amount of health benefits. And what's very interesting is that it's actually been used with clinical populations. Your first instinct would be, well, these intensities are so high, it might be unsafe for certain types of populations. If it's recommended, if it's prescribed properly, obviously in the right type of environment where people have been trained and use the right type of equipment, and don't forget your pre-participation screening, right, of your patients and clients. With all those things in order, it can be used with clinical POPs. You know, I looked at the poster, somebody did a poster out there, and the posters are very impressive, by the way, on HIIT training versus continuous training. And the outcomes were that they both had the same types of benefits, equal benefits from that type of training. And that's the trend we see a lot in the literature with health, with HIIT, you know, HIIT outcomes and HIIT interventions. So we see a lot on the aerobic side with many different types of cardiovascular metabolic risk profiles and some of those neat outcomes. I tried hard to look and really see if I can pin down in the literature lately, does HIIT have an advantage with some specific outcomes? There's a number of meta-analyses and different studies out there that indicate, I'm going to say the jury's still out, but there's a number of studies that say that with HIIT training you will get greater VO2 peaks. And some other types of cardiovascular outcomes. And these studies were with special populations. So they were with cardiac patients. Some of them were with obese samples. So it depends on the group that you're looking with. But I think the takeaway is definitely that HIIT training has many exceptional and beneficial outcomes. Let's see. Okay, whoops, sorry. Before we move on to talk about aquatics, all right, people say, well, is there a disadvantage to HIIT, or are there contraindications to HIIT training? And, you know, it's probably good to mention that if somebody has uncontrolled diabetes, unstable in their chronic condition, all right, HIIT training might not be for them. So there's some specific types of contraindications given that clinical condition that you need to be aware of, okay? But overall, if you remember these components, I really think that it can be prescribed safely and very effectively. So you need to remember the modality that you're working with, okay? Not everybody can swim, say, for example. Some people are not as comfortable on a treadmill as they would be on a cycle, all right? The proper prescription, the intensities, as you know, are going to change with age, okay, with the nature of the condition, with the fitness level, all right? The motivation issue. People do get very pumped with HIIT training, but there are some questions because it is so intense. Will people really adhere to that type of exercise in the long run? Would it be nice if you paired that with continuous training and alternative different types of training? That's what some of the papers suggested. All right, and the variety. So that's what I'm saying. Just being able to mix that up, maybe starting with one HIIT type of training session a week, and then going from there. So I thought to myself, okay, it's a nice segue. Okay, for somebody who maybe is really feeling it on land. All right, too tough on the knees with these high intensities, or I've got that bad shoulder. All right, and there's somebody who just isn't into being on a treadmill. All right. What are some alternatives? And that's where I talk about HIIT and water. So let's start talking about aquatics. That's a nice segue. All right, I think that any swimmers or aquatic exercise people, yay, right? Hail to the water, I love it. Okay, so aquatic exercise comes in many forms, right? We can lump swimming into that. You can lump diving and other types of recreational water activities into aquatic exercise. But to kind of narrow this down, and for the purpose of showing you a little bit of what I've done and where some of the cool evidence points to the benefits of HIIT training, we're going to be talking about aquatic exercise in shallow water. So we specifically mentioned it's performed in an upright stance, all right, shallow water, and the depths can vary, and I'm going to talk about the effects of that in just a second. But it is extremely popular, and I thought that was a good definition starting point from where we're headed. All right. So aquatic exercise is really popular. It's extremely popular in the southern states, places where you can swim year-round and when there's a lot of outdoor pools. We can see that these programs, in many cases, particularly the clinical populations, they're considered evidence-based, and they've been recommended and put out there by trained health fitness professionals, okay, for people who have been cleared and who are given a thumbs up to exercise. It's extremely popular, as I just said, and these are a lot of the populations that we see participating in aquatic exercise. But I want to just mention, it's an awesome alternative to land-based. So it's a wonderful form of cross-training. If you have an athlete, a team sports athlete, and they're developing, periodization and planning their macro cycle for the whole year. Getting in the water is a wonderful, wonderful alternative. When you look at why it's so popular, people say it allows freedom of movement because you can get in the water and move however you want, right? You can get a lot of work done. It's social. Okay, I can talk to my neighbor if I'm doing head out activity. But my colleague and I, the person that I've done the most work with, we love it, and anybody who's in aquatics, when we hear people say, because it feels good. It feels good and it's fun, all right? So those are the two best reasons why that I like to hear. All right. So I had the pleasure of talking with a number of students over the lunch break, and it was really nice to meet those of you, and all of you for that matter. And there were several of you who are interested in physical therapy. Okay, so just as a healthy reminder, aquatic exercise has a very rich rehabilitative history, all right, and the research has shown extensive benefits, right, in many clinical populations across the lifespan. So we see a lot done in these areas. A lot of the research funding has traditionally been heavy, kind of in the bone joint, neuromuscular area, but we're hoping to see that kind of branch out. Interestingly enough, we're seeing aquatics and Alzheimer's and aquatics and fibromyalgia now. So we're seeing Parkinson's patients. So we're seeing more research in those areas. Okay, before I start to talk about aquatic HIIT, I think it's good reminder to go back and take a look at the properties of water. And this is what really makes being in water and those benefits that you can get quite different than what we see on land. All right, so let's just take a quick look at these. The first would be density. So density we're looking at in terms of mass per unit volume, right? This is going to give us this heaviness and thickness that we feel, and specifically, water is more dense than air at sea level, right? But the interesting point is our whole body, whole body density, right, is slightly less than water. So that sets it up that we can float, right? And that leads to the next property, buoyancy. So with buoyancy, we're going to definitely see a nice offloading of the joints, depending upon the type of water that we're in, sometimes more so. But the more we are immersed, right, the more offloaded we are. So a little light bulb can go on and just say that for some populations, this would be extremely beneficial, right? Anybody who is unable to, chronically or regularly do land-based exercise. Okay, so we'll just kind of label it as that. Hydrostatic pressure. All right, hydrostatic pressure is that squeezing that we feel when we get in the water. And if you go deeper, it's even more intense, right? Just as a reminder, the pressure that we feel is going to be equal on all sides of the body, right, regardless of the depth. And we're going to come back to this example in just a second. But viscosity is the resistance that we feel in the water. So this really sets up the stage nicely for, setting up an environment where we're trying to increase those viscous effects, increasing resistance, and then hopefully increasing intensity, right? And energy expenditure. Okay, thermodynamics. So water is a wonderful conductor of heat, right? And depending upon the situation of the body temperature and the temperature of the water, all right, we're going to see interesting exchanges of heating or cooling, okay, depending upon the situation. Certain populations are going to benefit from specific temperature ranges. So, just as an example, and I think you all would realize this, an arthritic population, right, is going to want warmer water. It's going to make them feel better. It's going to increase their ability to move full range of motion, right? And many studies indicate that it decreases pain. All right, so I have a secretary who's dealing with some arthritis in her knees, and I'm begging her to get into warm water. All right. All right. So looking at those. Hydrodynamic properties that I just mentioned, those 4 or 5 properties that we mentioned, they're going to have specific outcomes, all right, and benefits, okay, in particular areas depending upon the nature of that property, all right. Being in water just when we're immersed, so we're not talking about exercise yet, just going in the water really actually changes many of the major body systems. Specifically, we're going to see very interesting changes to the cardiovascular system, respiratory system, increases in muscle and brain flow, all right, and a much better ability to move easily. So going back to that hydrostatic pressure example, all right, I just took cardiac responses as an example, all right. So when we're immersed, no exercise yet, okay, everybody? Let's look at some of these really interesting benefits, all right. That squeezing effect is going to push more blood to your core, right? Because of that whole effect, the heart has to work less, and we're going to see a drop in heart rate, yet we see an increase in cardiac output and stroke volume, all right? Also, it affects the autonomic nervous system. So we see a decrease in the sympathetic activity, helps to calm us down, right? And that has an impact on the cardiovascular system as well, all right? So there's some very interesting effects that we see just at rest alone and from cardiovascular standpoint. Okay, so with those properties we talked about, when we're in a situation where we're trying to challenge those, work through them, work against them, all right, so we're deliberately altering them, we know that we're definitely increasing our intensity, much greater than when we're static at rest, all right, and in turn, as you would expect, right, that's going to alter, greatly influence what we're going to see in terms of the physiological response and how we perceive that intensity as well. All right, so let's go back to that intensity issue for just a second. If you're a clinician, right, monitoring intensity is very, very important. And it's important to all of you, anybody who's competing, you need to check in on pace and intensity and heart rates and things like that. Well, when it comes to heart rates in water, it can be a somewhat accurate predictor and sometimes not, all right? And that gets into issues around depth, right, and also temperature. So we're a little hesitant to always go with heart rate as the main intensity monitor. We like that perceived exertion again, all right? So if we come back and look here, we see that we can use an intensity self-regulation approach. We're using these verbal and visual cue systems to help us to prescribe those different types of, and challenge the outcomes related to those physical properties. And that would be increasing surface area, increasing velocity, right? Challenging and trying to get that intensity up. We've been really fortunate at the University of Pittsburgh. We've worked with Dr. Bob Robertson, who's now retired. He's a professor emeritus, but he validated what we call the Omni scale. And that was the scale I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. His scale is 0 to 10, and we have used that with our studies and really found with our participants that they're very, very, really well able to regulate their intensity, all right? And it's interesting the results that we've been seeing with all of that. Okay, so we talked about the hydrodynamic properties. We know that when we challenge those, right, we're going to see an increase in velocity, hopefully, and in turn, we're going to see that increase in resistance. All right, collectively, all of those factors are going to augment work output. What are we going to see then? We're going to see increases in energy expenditure. Pretty cool. And that sets the stage really nicely for what I call aquatic HIIT training. And the definition really is not terribly different from what we talked about on land, but the variety, okay, and the way we work with those components is different than what we've seen before working on land, right? So to be truthful, I was hesitant to start to explore aquatic exercise because my experience was teaching swimming and teaching lessons and things like that. And my image of aquatic exercise was, you know, people kind of bouncing around, right? Just kind of chilling out and floating around and talking to their buddy. And I got to be friends with Mary Sanders. She's my colleague from afar. She's in Nevada, and she's really an aquatics guru as far as I'm concerned. She's my mentor. But she quickly convinced me that that is not the case. In fact, you can really increase intensities to a much greater degree, really, than you would have thought. We decided that we wanted to pursue that. All right, we were very curious with this last slide, okay, in terms of the work output and energy expenditure, what we would really see if we got those high intensities up. Can we really do HIIT training the way we see it on land? All right. So a number of years ago, we set out to look at energy expenditure, and it was quite a bit of work, but we pulled it off. Our purpose here was to look at the energy expenditure and metabolic responses to that 40-minute shallow water aquatic exercise session. So we're really interested in seeing what we're going to produce with those intensities. We wanted to mimic a traditional aquatic exercise class, if you will. So, traditional classes are 45 minutes, right? 40 minutes to an hour, give or take. And so the components of that workout really similar to what you see if you go to your local Y. Okay, you take a regular class. We had a warm up, we had an aerobic portion, we had a muscular endurance, and then our cool down, all right? So that's how it was broken down, and we're going to come back to these components in just a second. But we used the sweat system, all right, and I'm going to talk about just this in the next slide. This was the kind of the systematic approach that we had to working with challenging those properties that we talked about before. All right, so the sweat system was created by my colleague Mary Sanders, who I just mentioned a minute ago. It was originally intended to help with functional mobility and increased fitness. Originally, it was set up for a senior population, all right, but it quickly changed, and she realized very fast you can adapt this to any population. All right, so those components that we just saw before for the aerobic segment, jogging, kicking, jumping, scissors, hover jogs. That's strange. What's a hover jog, right? All of these were performed in shallow water. Okay. So her SWEAT acronym here, if you will, all right, looked at these different methods of movements, ways to challenge those properties. Increasing speed, right? Coming off the bottom of the pool, rebounding, right? Enlarging your range of motion, so increasing your surface area. Moving those joints, right? Multiplanar, all kinds of different joint movements, and then the ability to travel, all right? I'm going to skip this one. I'm going to show you this video clip. So our subjects had a video-led class, all right? And we had an instructor, somebody performing it, and an instructor leading it. And we also had perceived exertion scale nearby to help gauge. All right, so this is the hover jog. And let's see if we can get this, thanks. Yeah, that'd be perfect. Three, two, one. Rebound.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Come on, up.
They look very strange, but boy, is it hard. You rebound off of the bottom of the pool, and that's my friend, my colleague Mary, and we were considering this, verbal and visual perceptual hearing, and then we wanted our subjects to self-regulate their intensities according to the HIIT scale that we mentioned before. So she rotated between very hard at 15, moderate, and then easy. That was our HIIT profile study. So, and it goes back to the whole premise we were talking about with HIIT in general, that you can make it what you want. You can play with those intervals and those durations. We got the metabolic data at the hard portion, or the very hard portion. That's what we captured when we were looking at the energy expenditures. But just I want to mention that to increase that surface area, our subject, if you looked at her quickly, she was wearing gloves, all right? So we had gloves, and for the muscular endurance portion, it looked like a big paddle, and it really was also able to help us activate the surface area issue and really work on those components like around viscosity and things like that. All right, so I just wanted to show you a snippet of data. We published this in the Physicians of Sports Medicine a number of years ago, but I was very excited. Here's what we saw. So in the 22-minute segment, all right, and this did not include warm-up, all right, these were the segments: jogging, kicking, jumping, scissors, and the hover jog that you just saw, all right. We saw 101 kcals expended in 22 minutes. That's pretty good. That was way higher than I ever anticipated, and higher than anything that had been seen in studies before. All right, so that was very encouraging to us. Also 7 METs. All right, and again, if you remember the metabolic equivalent task ranges of those physical activity guideline recommendations in our country, that fits in perfectly. All right, so that we were pretty pumped about that. We also saw that we fell with the whole entire workout. We fell, so this included the muscular endurance portion, which didn't give us quite as good of energy expenditure as we had thought. And there's some reasons behind that, and I'm happy to share that with you. But in all, the heart rate ranges, the target heart rate ranges as prescribed by American College of Sports Medicine, it fit in perfectly, okay? So again, we were very encouraged in terms of what we saw. What kind of workout was this? And yeah, I would say it qualified as a HIIT for sure. A couple years later, oh, and by the way, I just have to put this in there, that the one thing I regretted was that we were not able to report the metabolic data as a percentage of their VO2 max, because it's very hard to measure VO2 max in water, as you can imagine. So that prompted me to do another study after this one, where we looked at shallow water running. So we developed a protocol to measure VO2 via shallow water running, and Dr. Prims was a co-investigator on that study. So we published that a couple of years later too. So the aquatic HIIT issue, we wanted to explore this more. We wanted to see really how our data compared to what had been done before. And so we did a review with, Mary and I did a review with Dr. Barry Franklin, who is out of Beaumont Hospital, a wonderful cardiologist and amazing speaker. If you ever have a chance to hear him speak, he's fantastic. And he was very helpful with our paper. But in all, here's our study down here. Okay, some of these studies that we had looked at, and this is just a snippet, were interventions. Others were just kind of cross-sectional designs. But in all of these studies really saw some neat benefits in terms of cardiovascular outcomes. We saw increases in other aspects as well, anaerobic related too. But we came out, in the running. Okay, we were definitely in the mix with what had been done before. In terms of aquatic HIIT studies, which there aren't very many. All right, so that I'm fast forwarding a couple years because I got involved with some aquatics research through a military-funded study, and that was very exciting. We looked at a lot of different performance measures with combat swimmers, and that's what I've been doing for a number of years. But Mary and I kind of put our heads back together and we said, all right, we want to take a look at Aquatic HIIT. We want to really get the message out there. We want to look at clinical populations. We want to look at making recommendations because aquatics is very much understudied. And to me, it's kind of a hidden gem in terms of a modality that should be explored for all types of reasons, okay? And my specific areas of interest are cardiovascular and metabolic related, a little bit kind of similar to some of the things I was sharing on that cardiovascular slide. But we wanted to do our homework when we made these recommendations, so we did a pretty heavy search looking at aquatic exercise studies in general and aquatic HIIT studies. So we set out to look at different types of clinical populations and healthy populations too. But safe to say, when we looked at kind of cardiometabolic type of outcomes, with the aquatic exercise studies that have been done and aquatic HIIT related studies, very interesting health outcomes, and nothing came out glaringly ahead of what you see on land. But the message was that, aquatic HIIT training is, here again, that word, a wonderful alternative to what you can do on land. All right, so there's all kinds of benefits related to cardiovascular and metabolic that we saw in the literature. We took a look at obese samples, okay? And because a lot of people sort of debate, I don't think you can't lose weight in water, all right? And there have been some interventions done, and encouragingly, all right, we saw that, again, we saw the benefits very similar to what's been shown on land, okay? The second study here is a study that I did at the University of Pittsburgh a long time ago. It was actually a standard behavioral treatment program. It was a weight loss intervention. We compared obese women doing water exercise plus some walking to a walking-only group, all right? Both groups lost the same amount of weight. We saw the similar types of benefits in these health outcomes, cardiovascular outcomes. But what was very encouraging, only after 16 weeks, all right, the adherence rate was higher in the water group, and the enjoyment was higher in the water group, all right? And I had some professors at Pitt say, you're never going to get anybody in water to stick to that. And I thought, this is great. I showed them, right? But it opened the door to, I think, an area that we definitely have to explore more. These women absolutely loved it. I will say that we did set it up that they kind of had a private class. They had a private class, so they weren't, near the varsity swimmers. They also had an instructor who was very fit, but probably considered overweight if you had looked at her body composition. She was a really highly motivated young gal, our instructor. Another reason we think this worked was this was 15 years ago, over 15 years ago, or about 15 years ago. But the long story short is we were doing HIIT training. We didn't kind of call it that, but we did these alternating hard, extremely hard, and easy intervals. And this was pretty exciting when we saw these outcomes. So it works with obese populations too. And then finally we looked at neurological disorders, and there's some interesting stuff now about brain blood flow and some of the cognitive outcomes that they're looking at when you're exposed to water immersion, specifically warm water immersion, all right, as opposed to cold, which has its own set of physiological outcomes or effects, if you will. But we kind of combed the literature. We looked at traumatic brain injury, Parkinson's, MS patients, and stroke patients. And the outcome measures were different. We were looking at things related to mobility, balance and coordination, okay? And again, we saw those outcomes similar to what we see on land. But what was interesting is with this stroke, this kind of stuck out in a number of studies. With the stroke patients, we saw these better improvements from the water with the dynamic balance. And when you consider what we're looking for in terms of things like fall prevention and letting people explore how they feel and maintaining balance in water, we thought this was really encouraging. So that was exciting too. So hopefully I've convinced you. This is a little bit of a tangent, but a number of weeks ago we presented this talk, a variation of this talk at the ACSM Health Fitness Summit, and it was part of the Exercise is Medicine branch, if you will, okay? And they asked us to include some slides, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to keep them in today because I think we're all, if we're studying this as a major, if we're a professional in this field, we're all working towards the same common cause. And this initiative, it was perfect that Aquatic HIIT training fit into this because it really appeals to so many populations and is part of that effort to help prevent disease, right? Maintain disease. And that was the initiative of Dr. Salas and his colleagues a number of years ago, back in the 90s, to really promote that patients and clients would get assessed by a physician in terms of their physical activity and then referred to a qualified health fitness professional and additional resources to help prevent and manage chronic disease. So that's a very exciting initiative. Is Grove City a part of that? No, not yet. Neither is Pitt. It's okay. We're working on it. Also, and so it's interesting if you have a chance and you're cruising the ACSM website, check out the Exercise is Medicine campaign because it's really quite interesting. The credential recognizes, it's kind of a database, if you will, recognizes those qualified health fitness professionals who work with the clients and patients that have been referred by the healthcare providers. And supposedly there's changes coming in 2019. And the Exercise is Medicine, this program also is active and alive and well on campuses. And for my talk, I put my alma mater, I put Penn State on there, but and I have a picture of Pitt's campus. We're not a part of this yet, but the Exercise is Medicine initiative has really grown a lot on campuses to kind of work with that general mission of the program. All right, so hopefully, I'm a little bit biased and pro-aquatics if you haven't been able to tell, but you know, those of you who are becoming health fitness professionals, consider aquatic exercise, all right, as you work with your clients, because if you're working with them to help find something that is going to be effective and that feels good, all right, and when I did my talk, it was Mary and I, but I'll just say I think that aquatic HIIT training really is your solution, all right? So that's my pitch. That's it.